Silas Thorne stood in the center of his pitch-black penthouse, begging for a single watt of power to save his billions, while I sat in the darkness, watching his stock price evaporate into the night. They thought Zoraida Jaxon was just a ghost, a silent architect of numbers. Silas laughed when he blacklisted her father and buried his legacy in a shallow grave. He thought he was building an empire. He didn't realize he was building a coffin. As Zoraida checked the flickering digits on her matte-black tungsten cuff watch, she wasn't thinking about an apology. She was thinking about subsurface utility rights. Silas owned the smart grid, but he forgot to check who owned the cables. In the next hour, you will witness a masterclass in systemic asset seizure. This is not a story of luck. It is the clinical destruction of an arrogant man. Pay close attention, because the lights are about to go out forever. The penthouse of the Thorne Tower was a monument to the theology of light. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked a city that Silas Thorne believed he had bought with a stolen dream. The air inside smelled of cold ozone, raw silk, and the sickening metallic tang of institutional greed. It was the night of the Thorne Corp IPO, the moment a man who built his empire on theft became a god of the market. The elite of the world gathered like moths to a dying star, clinking glasses of champagne that cost more than my father's medical bills. They laughed with the volume of people who have never known the weight of a debt they couldn't pay. I moved through the glass doors like a silent predator in a field of golden sheep. My name is Zoraida Jaxon. Most of these people would never recognize me. I am a structural debt architect. I am the woman who rewires the financial nervous systems of failing nations. I have sat in rooms where the fate of millions was decided by a decimal point. I don't play with money. I play with the gravity that keeps money in place. My mahogany skin felt cool against the heat of the ballroom. A rich, dark map of golden undertones that absorbed the flickering light of the chandeliers. I felt the weight of my micro-braided high ponytail, a floor-length crown of precision. Each braid was wrapped in polished gunmetal rings. They clinked with a soft, industrial rhythm as I walked, the sound of a machine coming online. Beneath the sharp arc of my brows, my emerald green cat contacts didn't just observe the room, they audited it. I saw the net worth of every man and woman in that space. I saw the leverage they carried, the hidden liabilities behind their smiles. I was not here to celebrate. I was here to initiate a total system failure. Silas Thorne was at the center of the orbit, a sun made of stolen light. He was a man who understood the aesthetics of power but nothing of its architecture. He wore a suit of midnight navy, tailored to hide the hollow chest of a fraud. He smelled of sandalwood and the chemical clean of a life without consequences. 30 years ago, he stole a patent from my father. He used a non-compete clause like a razor to cut my family out of the future. He watched my father wither in an exile of silence, while he became the face of a sustainable world. I reached down, touching the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The surface was cold, unyielding. It had no numbers, no clock face to track the passage of time. Instead, it displayed a single row of neon green digits. The livestock price of Thorne Corp, $242.81. I watched the numbers flicker, a digital heartbeat, counting down the seconds of his relevance. The crowd parted for me, not because they knew who I was, but because they sensed the shift in the room's pressure. I moved with the grace of a panther in a cage made of glass. My narrow jaw was set, my gaze fixed on the man who thought he had reached the top of the mountain. Zoraida, Silas said. His voice was the sound of gravel falling on velvet. He hadn't seen me in a decade, not since the day he laughed at my father's funeral. You look like you've done well for yourself. The daughter of the man who couldn't keep up with the world. Are you here to ask for a job? Or perhaps a donation? The room went quiet. The clinking of glasses ceased. The elite leaned in to watch the king swat a fly. I didn't blink. I've stood 3 feet from him, my emerald eyes piercing through his expensive facade. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about the subsurface utility rights of the city of New York. I was thinking about the eminent domain clauses buried in the 1952 city infrastructure contracts. Laws Silas hadn't bothered to read because he was too busy looking at the sky. I am not here for a job, Silas, I said. My voice was a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate the champagne in his glass. And I am certainly not here for your money. I am here to deliver a prophecy. Silas laughed, a loud, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls. A prophecy. From a debt architect? Unless your prophecy involves my stock hitting 300 by midnight? I don't think I'm interested. I raised my right arm, allowing the light to catch the matte-black tungsten of my watch. The neon green digits flickered. 242. And 80 cents. Look at the clock, Silas, I whispered. It is currently 8:45 p.m. You are standing in a tower built on stolen patents. You are selling energy to a world that believes you own the grid. But you made one fundamental error in your architecture. You focused on the light, but you forgot to secure the darkness. Silas's smile didn't fade, but his eyes darkened. The arrogance was still there, but the first crack of doubt was forming in his foundation. What are you talking about? I stepped closer, invading his personal space with the clinical cold of a winter storm. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the heat of a man who believes he is invincible. You stole the light, I said, but the cables belong to the earth. And I just bought the earth. I looked him directly in his pupils, ignoring the hundreds of billionaires watching the exchange. At 9 p.m., Silas, the lights will not just go out in this tower. They will go out in your bank accounts. They will go out in your legacy. At 9 p.m., you will be a pauper. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the click. Silas looked at his own gold watch, then back at me. He tried to summon his authority. He tried to find a joke to break the tension, but his throat was dry. Security, he rasped. Get this woman out of here. She is clearly delusional. I didn't wait for them to touch me. I turned, my floor-length braids sweeping the floor with a metallic hiss. The gunmetal rings sang a final warning. I walked toward the elevators. Not looking back, I reached the mirrored doors and pressed the button. My reflection stared back at me. The emerald katais were glowing with a terrifying, icy calm. I checked my tungsten watch. 8-50-2. The stock price flickered. $241. The market was starting to sense the change in the atmosphere. A whisper was moving through the high-frequency trading algorithms. A question about the ownership of the subsurface conduits. A doubt about the validity of the Thorne Corp infrastructure deeds. Institutional revenge is not a loud event. It is a series of quiet, systemic deletions. It is the removal of the supports before the building even knows it is falling. Silas Thorne thinks he is a mogul of green energy. He is about to find out he is just a man standing in a very tall, very dark closet. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft, hissing sound. The descent began 87 times 78. Downstairs, the world was still moving. Cars were driving over the very cables I now controlled. Servers were humming with the power I was about to seize. The grid was alive, and it was mine. I reached the lobby and walked out into the cool night air. The city was a sea of light, $1 billion of electricity pulsing through the veins of the earth. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the vibration of the subway beneath my feet. The subsurface world, the world of pipes, conduits, and easements. I checked the watch. 8-50-9. The digits on the tungsten cuff began to move with a frantic velocity. 200, 180, 150. Upstairs, Silas Thorne was likely still laughing, still holding his champagne, still telling his friends that I was a ghost from the past. He forgot one thing about ghosts. We don't live in the light. We live in the foundations. The second hand on the digital display hit 0. The time was exactly 9 p.m. I didn't look up at the tower. I didn't need to. I heard the sound of a city losing its breath, a deep, structural moan of a massive transformer bank shutting down. The lights of the Thorne Tower didn't flicker. They vanished. A square mile of Manhattan went black. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I touched the gunmetal rings in my hair, adjusting the weight of the ponytail. The audit was no longer a prophecy. It was a reality. The stock price on my wrist hit zero. "Welcome to the darkness, Silas," I whispered. "I hope you like the view." The laughter of a billionaire is a jagged, heavy sound. It does not carry warmth. It carries the weight of a man who believes the laws of physics and finance have been rewritten in his image. Silas Thorne threw his head back, his throat exposing the pulse of a man who had never been told no. The sound echoed off the reinforced glass of the penthouse, rising above the murmur of the world press and the rhythmic clicking of 100 high-end cameras. Behind him, the digital ticker of the stock exchange was a neon green waterfall. Thorne Corp. $500 billion in market capitalization. It was a number so large it ceased to be money and became a religion. The elite in the room followed his lead. They laughed because Silas laughed. They mocked because Silas mocked. The air grew thick with the scent of vintage scotch and the suffocating, oily perfume of sycophants. The temperature seemed to rise with the collective arrogance of the room, but I remained the center of the cold. I stood perfectly still. My rich mahogany skin was a masterpiece of stillness in a room of frantic motion. The golden undertones of my complexion caught the strobe lights of the paparazzi, gleaming like polished wood in an ancient cathedral. I reached up slowly. My fingers brushed the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The metal was cold, unyielding. It felt like the railing of a bridge overlooking an abyss. The neon green digits on the display flickered. $242. The stock was holding. For now. Silas wiped a fake tear from his eye. His Ivy League poise was a mask for the predatory animal underneath. He turned toward the wall of cameras. The world press was watching. The T1 markets in London, New York, and Tokyo were listening to every breath he took. "Did you hear that?" Silas shouted, his voice booming with the false authority of a man standing on a hollow foundation. This woman, the daughter of a man who couldn't handle a simple non-compete clause. She says I will be a pauper by 9 p.m. He stepped toward me, invading my space with the smell of sandalwood and expensive gin. He gestured to the glowing ticker behind him. 500 billion Zoraida. Look at the numbers. Numbers don't lie. I am the face of the green revolution. I own the patents. I own the grid. I own the very light that allows these cameras to see your pathetic, desperate face. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. The internal monologue of a structural debt architect is a world of pure clinical math. I wasn't listening to his insults. I was calculating the interest rates on the Thorne Corp municipal bonds. I was analyzing the default triggers in his subsurface utility contracts. I saw the building as it truly was. Not a monument of light, but a precarious stack of liabilities waiting for the wind to change my deep set. Emerald green K-tie contacts locked onto his pupils. They didn't reflect the room. They absorbed it. In the dark center of my gaze, Silas saw the shadow of the man he had erased 30 years ago. My father. The man whose lungs were filled with the dust of the industry Silas had stolen from him. "You focus on the valuation, Silas," I said. My voice was a low, sharp frequency that sliced through the laughter like a diamond through glass. "You think a $500 billion market cap is a shield? But you forget the rules of the grid. Valuation is an opinion. Debt is a fact." The room went silent again. The shift in the atmosphere was physical. A sudden, sharp drop in pressure. The press moved closer, their microphones reaching out like the tongues of hungry animals. Silas's jaw tightened, then narrow. Sharp lines of his face became jagged. "What debt?" he hissed. "My company has zero leverage. We are self-funded. We are the creditors." I touched the gunmetal rings in my hair. The high ponytail of microbraids shifted over my shoulder. a floor-length weight of industrial precision. The rings clinked, soft, metallic sound that felt like the cocking of a weapon. You are self-funded in the air. I said, but you are a tenant in the earth. I raised my right arm. The matte-black tungsten watch was a dark, heavy anchor against my mahogany skin. I tapped the side of the cuff. The neon green digits changed. They were no longer displaying the stock price. They were displaying a countdown to a legal reversion. 8 minutes. Silas laughed again. But it was different this time. It was the laugh of a man who had realized the door was locked from the outside. You're talking about the land. I own this block. I have the deeds. I have the sovereign titles. You own the surface, Silas, I whispered. I leaned in. The scent of my father's old workshop, the smell of grease and burnt copper, seemed to emanate from my skin. But in 1952, the city of New York signed a series of subsurface utility easements. They are perpetual, non-negotiable, and sovereign. Silas's eyes darted to his lead counsel, a man who was suddenly looking at his phone with the face of a man watching a train wreck. The easements were for the tunnels. I continued. The conduits. The very veins that carry the Thorne Corp electricity from the substation to the world. You built your throne on top of those veins, but you never bought the rights to the space they occupy. The room felt like it was shrinking. The sound of the ticking digital clock on my wrist seemed to grow louder, expanding until it filled the penthouse. Tick, tick, tick. The press began to murmur. I saw a reporter from the Financial Times start typing frantically on her tablet. The word easement was moving through the market like a virus. High-frequency trading bots were already beginning to flag the Thorne Corp ticker. The waterfall of green light behind Silas stopped. The numbers flickered, turned yellow. 500 billion. 490 billion. I stood my ground. My mahogany complexion was a dark, polished shield against his frantic energy. The golden undertones of my skin seemed to glow as the room's lights began to dim. A pre-programmed, systemic brownout. You stole a patent, I said. The words were heavy. Final. You thought you stole a dream, but you only stole the appearance of one. You built a sustainable future on an unsustainable lie. And now, the landowner is here to collect the rent. Silas stepped back, tripping slightly on the edge of the expensive silk rug. The rug he had bought with my father's retirement fund. The rug he had stood on while he watched the world bow to him. Who is the landowner? He screamed, his voice cracking. Show me the deed. I didn't need to show him. The math was already doing the work. I checked the Matte-Black Tungsten Cuff. 5 minutes. The stock price was now a frantic, downward red streak. 300 billion. 200 billion. The world press was no longer taking photos of Silas. They were taking photos of the ticker. The king was being liquidated in real time. Institutional revenge is a beautiful thing. It is the ultimate auditor. It strips away the suits, the scotch, and the arrogance, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of the theft. I reached up and touched the gunmetal rings in my hair. The weight of the braids felt like a physical connection to the earth, to the subsurface conduits, to the legacy Silas Thorne had tried to bury. The ground does not forget, Silas, I whispered, and it does not forgive. I turned my back on him. The clinking of the gunmetal rings was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the room. I walked toward the center of the ballroom, passing the billionaires who were now frantically calling their brokers. They were no longer moths to his star. They were rats leaving a sinking ship. I stood in the center of the dark, the emerald contacts in my eyes glowing like the grid itself. I checked the watch. 3 minutes. The Thorne Corp valuation hit 100 billion. A $400 billion loss in less than an hour. A world record in systemic destruction. Silas Thorne was standing by the glass, his face pressed against the cold surface. Looking out at the city he thought he had conquered. He didn't realize that the lights weren't flickering. They were dying. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and I am the architect of the blackout. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating velvet that swallowed the screams of the elite. In the Thorne Tower penthouse, the silence that followed the blackout was heavier than the noise of the party. The scent of expensive scotch was replaced by the cold, metallic smell of stagnant air and the sharp, acidic tang of sudden, unfiltered terror. Behind the glass, the Manhattan skyline had been decapitated. The glowing crown of the city was gone, leaving only a jagged stone silhouette against a bruised sky. I stood in the center of the room. The emergency red lights flickered to life, casting long, bloody shadows across the marble floor. My rich mahogany skin absorbed the crimson glow, making me look like a figure carved from ancient, vengeful earth. The golden undertones of my complexion shimmered beneath the surface, a hidden fire waiting for the oxygen of justice. I reached up, my fingers grazing the gunmetal rings wrapped around my high ponytail. They felt cold, industrial, absolute. The micro braids shifted with a soft, metallic hiss, like the scales of a panther preparing to leap. Beneath my brow, my emerald green cat-eye contacts were the only things in the room that held any light. There were two glowing embers, auditing the wreckage of Silas Thorne's arrogance. Silas was fumbling in the dark, his hands, once so steady when signing away my father's life, were now shaking. He was a man who had forgotten how to exist without a spotlight. He didn't see me approach. He didn't hear the clinking of the gunmetal rings. He only felt the sudden, sharp drop in the room's temperature as I stepped into his personal space. "Zoraida," he whispered. The name sounded like a prayer for a mercy I did not possess. "What have you done? This is illegal. This is sabotage. The board will have you in a federal cell by morning." I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence grow, expanding it until it filled the 68 stories beneath our feet. I reached down and adjusted the Matte-Black Tungsten Cuff Watch on my right wrist. The digital display flickered in the red light. The neon green digits of the Thorne Corp stock price were falling. $120. $110. $80. The market was not just panicking, it was hemorrhaging. Institutional revenge is not about anger. "It is about fiduciary duty," I said. My voice was a low, sovereign frequency that cut through his frantic breathing. "You call this sabotage. I call it a reclamation of sovereign assets. You think you are being attacked. In reality, you are simply being audited by the ground itself." I pulled a thin silver tablet from the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer. I swiped the screen, projecting a holographic image into the stagnant air of the boardroom. It was a map of New York City, but not the map Silas knew. This was the 1952 subsurface infrastructure. "Grid, look at the coordinates, Silas," I commanded. He squinted at the blue light. His Ivy League poise had completely dissolved, revealing the brittle, hollow core of a man who built his throne on stolen patents. He saw the grid. He saw the red lines intersecting beneath the very foundation of his headquarters. "What is this?" He rasped. "This is the 1952 Subsurface Easement," I said. The words were heavy, technical, lethal. In the mid-century, the city of New York realized that its power lines and conduits were becoming a disorganized mess. To fix it, they created a series of permanent, non-negotiable easements. They separated the rights of the surface from the rights of the subsurface. Silas stepped back, his boot heels clicking against the marble. His eyes darted to the dark corners of the room, looking for his lawyers, looking for a loophole. "Everyone knows about easements," he snapped. "We have a permit for the foundation. We have the right to occupy the space. You have the right to occupy the building." I countered. "But you don't have the right to touch the conduits." The 1952 contract was signed with a private infrastructure foundation, a nameless entity that the city used to manage the deep earth energy transfers. That contract states that the subsurface space, and every cable, pipe, and wire within it, is sovereign property. I paused, watching the realization bleed into his face. The internal monologue of a debt architect is a world of pure mathematical closure. I was remembering my father's basement, The thousands of blueprints he had studied. The maps he had traced until his fingers were stained with ink and his lungs were filled with the dust of forgotten history. He didn't just invent a patent. He discovered the legal geography of the city. He found the hole in the world that Silas Thorne had fallen into. "You thought my father was a failure?" I whispered. The emerald light of my contacts intensified. "You thought because you stole his patent. You stole his power. But while you were looking at the sun, he was looking at the bedrock. He knew that one day, the city would grow too large for its own cables. He knew that whoever owned the 1952 easement owned the heart of Manhattan." I touched the Matte-Black Tungsten Watch again. The stock price hit $40. The Thorne Corp valuation had just lost $400 billion in 40 minutes. This was not just a crash. This was a liquidation event. As of 3 hours ago, said, the Jaxon Infrastructure Trust purchased the remaining shares of that 1952 foundation. I am now the sole trustee of the subsurface sovereign deed, which means, Silas, that your smart grid is technically trespassing on my property. Silas's jaw dropped. His face was a mask of cold, ugly disbelief. That's impossible. A city easement can't be used to seize a private corporation. There is litigation. There is due process. I didn't smile. Smiling is for people who have something left to lose. This is not a seizure. I corrected him. This is a toll. The 1952 contract allows the easement holder to charge a maintenance and access fee for any energy passing through the conduits. I have set that fee at $1 million per second. The sound of his heart beating seemed to fill the room. A frantic, irregular rhythm. 1 million a second. That's $1 billion in less than 20 minutes. Exactly, I said. And because your smart grid is automated, your corporate accounts are already being debited by the Federal Reserve Clearinghouse. They don't see a lawsuit. They see a valid, sovereign invoice. By the time your lawyers get a judge on the phone, Thorne Corp will be an empty shell. I felt the cold weight of the institutional revenge closing in. It was like the pressure of the deep earth, unrelenting, absolute. Silas. Thorne had used a non-compete clause to starve my family. Now I was using a utility easement to starve his empire. The red emergency lights began to fade. The backup generators were failing. The building was truly dying now. It was a hollow, steel ghost. Silas Thorne sank into a chair. The chair he had used to preside over the theft of a century. He looked at his hands in the dark, realizing they were empty, realizing that the lights were never coming back on. "You are a monster," he rasped. "I am an architect," I replied. My micro braids clinked with a soft, final metallic sound. I build systems that work, and I dismantle systems that don't. I checked my tungsten watch one last time. 9:10 p.m. The stock price was now a single digit. $9. The market had realized the truth. Thorne Corp didn't own the energy. It was just a tenant in a world I controlled. I turned and walked toward the emergency stairs, my floor-length ponytail sweeping the marble floor with the sound of a closing ledger. The gunmetal ring sang a sharp, industrial goodbye. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and the audit is only beginning. The darkness inside the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that had teeth. Outside Manhattan was a jagged silhouette of dead glass and cooling steel. The city's heartbeat had skipped a beat, and I was the reason for the arrhythmia. The air in the room was stagnant, cold. It smelled of ozone and the bitter, metallic sweat of a man who realized his throne was made of paper. Silas Thorne was hyperventilating in the corner. The sound of his breath was a rhythmic rasp against the silence. He was a man who had built a life out of stolen light. Now he was finally beginning to understand the weight of the shadow. I stood by the massive mahogany table. My rich mahogany skin blended into the darkness, making me a part of the architecture of the room. The red emergency lights flickered once, casting a bloody, crimson glow over my sharp jawline. My emerald green K-tie contacts caught the light. They glowed like twin radioactive embers, auditing every move Silas made. I reached down, my fingers grazing the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The metal was cold, a heavy industrial anchor. The neon green digits flickered in the dark. 0.00. Thorne Corp stock had effectively ceased to exist. Silas lunged for the landline on the desk. His hands were shaking so violently the handset clattered against the wood. He was trying to call his security team, his lawyers, his fixers. He didn't realize that in my world, there are no fixers for a structural collapse of this magnitude. It won't work, Silas, I said. My voice was a low, sovereign frequency. It didn't echo. It simply occupied the space. The VoIP servers are down. The internal mesh network is dead. You are currently an island in a sea of your own making. Silas turned. His face was a mask of jagged, white terror. What do you want? He screamed, his voice cracking like dry glass. Money. I'll give you whatever you want. 10% of the company. 20, just turn the power back on before the markets. Open in Tokyo. You are destroying the global grid. I stepped closer. The gunmetal rings in my micro braids clinked, a soft, metallic chime that sounded like the closing of a vault door. My floor-length ponytail swept the floor behind me, a heavy braided shadow. I am not here to save your company, Silas. I am here to execute the astute ghost utility clause. I tapped a command into the silver tablet. A holographic blueprint erupted from the center of the table. It displayed the Thorne Tower in translucent blue. But the focus wasn't on the 80 stories of glass. The focus was on the earth beneath. A complex, interconnected maze of conduits, tunnels, and high-tension cables. You focus on the sky, I said, the emerald fire in my eyes intensifying. You believe that because you own the buildings. You own the power. But you made a fundamental error in your due diligence. You checked the surface deeds, but you never checked the subsurface rights. I swiped the image. A golden layer appeared over the blue conduits. It was a map of the ghost grid, the physical infrastructure that Thorne Corp used to move electricity from the upstate dams to the city's heart. In 1952, the city didn't just grant easements. They granted sovereign deeds to the physical material of the grid. I continued. While Silas Thorne owns the Thorne Spire, the Jaxon Infrastructure Trust owns the physical copper, the ceramic insulators, and the reinforced concrete tunnels carrying the energy. Silas stared at the hologram. His breathing slowed, replaced by a cold, paralyzing realization. You can't own the wires, he whispered. They are public utilities. They were, I corrected him, until your grandfather convinced the city to privatize them in the 70s. He thought he was being clever, moving the liability off the city's books and into a nameless shell company. But he forgot to ensure the shell company stayed in the family. My father found that shell company 30 years ago. He spent every penny Silas Thorne didn't steal to buy the controlling interest. I touched the matte-black tungsten watch. The metal felt like a promise kept. My father knew he couldn't win a patent war against a man with your resources. So he stopped fighting for the light. He started fighting for the conduit. He realized that the person who owns the pipe controls the water, and the person who owns the cable controls the empire. Silas lunged at the hologram, trying to swipe it away as if he could delete the reality of the situation. It's a lie. I have the operational permits. I have the right of way. You have a permit to use the grid. I said, the words were sharp, final, but you don't have a permit to occupy my physical space without a valid lease. And as of 9 p.m. tonight, I have terminated the lease for Thorne Corp under the Ghost Utility Clause. Unauthorized energy transfer through my cables is considered criminal trespass of a sovereign asset. I felt a slow, rhythmic pulse in my fingertips. The internal monologue of a dead architect is a world of pure, mathematical justice. I remembered the day Silas evicted my father from his lab. I remembered the way he laughed when he told my father that the future has no room for the obsolete. Now, the future was dark, and Silas Thorne was the one who didn't belong. Silas collapsed into his leather chair. It's the same chair where he had signed the documents that erased my family's name. He looked small. His Ivy League poise was gone, leaving only a hollow, terrified man staring into a void he couldn't negotiate with. "How much?" he asked. His voice was a ghost of a sound. "What is the price to turn the lights back on?" "The price is not money, Silas," I said. The emerald light of my contacts seemed to fill the room. "The price is total liquidation. Every patent you stole, every acre of land you seized, every kilowatt of energy you claimed as your own. It all reverts to the Jaxon Trust as compensation for 30 years of unauthorized usage fees." I checked the tungsten cuff one last time. The neon green digits were steady at 0. Thorne Corp was no longer a company. It was an encumbrance, a legal debt that could never be repaid. "You have 5 minutes to sign the voluntary asset transfer," I whispered. "If you don't, the Federal Reserve will trigger the systemic default. The bank accounts of every Thorne Corp board member will be frozen, and you will spend the rest of your life answering for the blackout of the century." Silas looked at the silver tablet on the table. The transfer deed was already open, waiting for a digital signature. He looked at the window, at the dark city that used to be his kingdom. He realized that the power wasn't coming back. It's not for him. He reached for the tablet. His fingers were cold, white. He signed. The sound of the digital confirmation was a soft, electronic chirp that felt like a gavel hitting a block. The lights didn't come back on. The silence remained. But the ownership of the grid had moved. I picked up the tablet. The charcoal silk of my suit rustled, a quiet, lethal sound. I turned toward the door, my micro braids clinking with the rhythm of a victor. "You said the future had no room for the obsolete, Silas." I said over my shoulder, "You were right. You just didn't realize that you were the one who had been replaced." I walked out of the boardroom, leaving Silas Thorne in the darkness of a tower he no longer owned, in a city that no longer knew his name, standing on dirt that belonged to the woman he thought he had erased. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and I just rewired the world. The silence in the control room was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum, a hollow space where the ghost of an empire used to breathe. Outside Manhattan was a black, jagged canyon. The city that never sleeps was currently in a coma, and I was the one holding the scalpel. The scent of the room was cold, sterile. It smelled of cooling server racks and the sharp, acidic tang of a billionaire's sudden, unfiltered panic. I stood before the primary holographic interface. My rich mahogany skin glowed in the soft, digital blue light of the console. The golden undertones of my complexion were a warm contrast to the icy emerald fire in my cat-eye contacts. I moved with the grace of a panther patrolling a new territory. Every motion was precise, mathematical, absolute. I reached up, my fingers grazing the gunmetal rings wrapped around my micro-braided high ponytail. The polished metal clinked, a soft industrial rhythm that echoed the ticking of the city's heart. I checked the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The heavy metal was an anchor, a physical weight that reminded me of the gravity I now controlled. The watch had no hands, no numbers, only the neon green digits flickering against the dark tungsten. Thorne Corp stock, 0.00. The market capitalization had been erased. But the debt was just beginning to breathe. Silas Thorne sat on the floor of his own boardroom. The Ivy League pedigree had been stripped away, leaving only a shivering, broken man clutching a dead cell phone. The sandalwood scent of his arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the raw, ugly smell of a man who realized he was no longer a king. He looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot, tracing the sharp, narrow line of my jaw as if searching for a flicker of mercy. "You can't do this," he rasped. His voice was a jagged shard of glass. "The Federal Reserve will intervene. This is an act of economic terrorism. You are holding the energy grid of the East Coast hostage. I didn't blink. I didn't look away from the holographic maps. The internal monologue of a structural debt architect is a place of pure logic. I wasn't thinking about terrorism. I was thinking about the toll protocol. I was thinking about the 1952 Subsurface Easement. A sovereign deed that was signed before Silas Thorne was even a whisper of a lie. I'm not holding anything hostage, Silas, I said. My voice was a low, sovereign frequency. I am simply enforcing the terms of a private infrastructure contract. A contract you inherited when you stole my father's work. You wanted the grid, now you have to pay for the transfer. I tapped a command into the silver tablet. The interface turned a deep, lethal red. The toll protocol was now active. As of 9:05 p.m., I continued. The Jaxon Infrastructure Trust has implemented a transfer fee under the Ghost Utility Clause. The owner of the physical conduits is entitled to a maintenance surcharge for every kilowatt of energy moving through the subsurface space. I have set that fee at $1 million per second. Silas lunged forward, scrambling on his hands and knees across the marble floor. 1 million a second. That's impossible. No company on Earth has that kind of liquidity. You are bankrupting the entire sector. I turned to face him. The floor-length microblade swept the stone behind me with a metallic hiss. The gunmetal rings sang a sharp final warning. Thorne Corp claimed to be the face of a sustainable future, I whispered. But sustainability requires a foundation. You built your empire on land you didn't title, using cables you didn't own. You thought the subsurface was a free ride. But in my world, the audit never stops. I raised my right arm. The matte-black tungsten watch caught the red light. The neon digits began to move. They were no longer tracking the stock price. They were tracking the automated liquidation. 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. The sound of the digital countdown filled the silence of the penthouse. A rhythmic, clinical ticking. It was the sound of Silas Thorne's bloodline being drained in real time. Institutional revenge is not a loud event. It is a masterclass in systemic destruction. I watched the data stream from the Federal Reserve Clearinghouse. Because the toll protocol was linked to a sovereign utility deed, the billing was automated. It bypassed the standard corporate accounts. It reached directly into the Thorne Corp liquidity reserves. It pierced the offshore holding companies. It moved through the tax havens in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands like a ghost. Silas grabbed his chest. His pulse was jumping, visible in the hollow of his throat. "Stop it," he pleaded. "I'll sign the papers. I'll give you the patents back. Stop the toll. The patents were never yours to give." I said. The emerald fire in my eyes was unyielding. "And the papers are already signed. You signed them when you tried to use emergency liquidity to save your IPO. You triggered a cross-collateralization clause you didn't understand. You pledged your personal assets as a guarantee for the grid's operational stability." I checked the watch. 60 million. In 1 minute. "Silas, you have lost more than your father made in a lifetime. In 10 minutes, you will have lost the Thorne estate. In an hour, you will owe the Jaxon Trust more money than the Thorne Corp was ever worth." I felt a cold professional satisfaction. My father had spent 40 years in a workshop smelling of burnt copper and disappointment. Silas Thorne had spent 40 years in a boardroom smelling of success and theft. The math was finally balancing the ledger. The structural debt architect was closing the account. The red lights in the tower began to flicker. The power was trying to come back on. The automated systems were attempting to reroute the energy, but every time a kilowatt moved, the toll was charged. The more Silas Thorne tried to save his grid, the faster he destroyed his life. "It is a perfect feedback loop," I whispered. "The more you struggle, the more you owe. You are literally paying to witness your own execution." Silas Thorne slumped against the glass wall, looking out at the dark city. He saw the lights of other buildings starting to return. The rest of Manhattan was being restored. I had isolated the Thorne grid. I had turned his empire into a dark, expensive island. This is the weight of fiduciary duty. I said, the clinking of the gunmetal rings was the only sound besides the watch. You had a duty to the shareholders, to the employees, to the truth. You defaulted on all of them. Now, the asset seizure is the only cure. I walked toward the exit. My high ponytail of braids trailed behind me, a heavy, metallic shadow on the marble. The emerald Ketai contacts didn't reflect the red lights. They seemed to glow from within. A source of power that Silas Thorne could never steal. I reached the elevator. The doors opened with a soft, hissing sound. The backup power was only working. For the trustee, Silas looked at me one last time. His face was a mask of total, systemic defeat. Who are you? He asked. I am Zoraida Jaxon. I said. The words were a period at the end of a sentence. And the lights are out. Silas, the elevator doors closed. The hum of the descent was smooth, mechanical, absolute. I checked the Matte-Black Tungsten Watch. 120 million. The toll protocol was working perfectly. By the time I reached the lobby, the Thorne family would be a memory. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the Jaxon name would be on the deed. Institutional revenge is not a fight. It is a rewiring. And I just turned the switch. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and the grid belongs to me. The air in the control center was no longer air. It was a cold, pressurized vacuum of failed dreams. The scent of the room was the smell of a dead machine, burnt silicon, static ozone, and the sharp, acidic sweat of a man who realized his bloodline was being liquidated in real time. Outside the reinforced glass, Manhattan was a sea of ink. The lights of the Thorne Tower were not just off. They were a memory. I stood in the center of the darkness. My rich mahogany skin glowed with a deep, inner fire. Polished gold undertones reflecting the dim, crimson light of the emergency displays. I felt the weight of my micro-braided high ponytail. Each floor-length strand was heavy with gunmetal rings. They clinked with a soft, industrial chime as I shifted my weight. Like the ticking of a doomsday clock made of steel, I reached down, my fingers grazing the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The metal was an anchor, a cold promise against my skin. The neon green digits flickered with a frantic, lethal velocity. They weren't tracking time. They were tracking a hemorrhage. Silas Thorne was on his knees. The Ivy League pedigree had dissolved into a shivering, broken mess on the marble floor. His tailored suit, once a symbol of unassailable power, was now just a wrinkled shroud. He looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot, tracing the sharp, narrow line of my jaw as if searching for a loophole in the physics of the universe. Stop the billing, he rasped. His voice was a jagged shard of glass in the silence. I have 300 million in a liquidity reserve in Zurich. I have a gold vault in Singapore. Take it. Just stop the protocol before the Federal Reserve flags the accounts. I didn't blink. My emerald green Ketai contacts caught the red light, glowing like twin radioactive embers in the void. The internal monologue of a structural debt architect is a place of absolute zero. I wasn't listening to his pleas. I was listening to the sound of the institutional freeze. The sound of a global nervous system shutting down. Zurich is already gone, Silas, I said. My voice was a low, sovereign frequency. It didn't echo. It simply occupied the room like a gas. Singapore was drained 3 minutes ago. Your money is not disappearing. It is simply returning to the source. I tapped a command into the silver tablet. The primary holographic display erupted in a flash of lethal digital violet. It was a map of the Thorne Corp financial structure. Thousands of interconnected nodes representing offshore accounts, holding companies, and shadow trusts. In real time, the nodes were turning black. Liquidity is like blood, I whispered. If it stops moving, the body dies. But you didn't just stop moving. You were being drained by the very grid you thought you controlled. The institutional freeze was a masterclass in systemic asset seizure. By linking the toll protocol to the subsurface utility deed, I hadn't just built his company, I had created a sovereign obligation. Under the 1952 Infrastructure Act, a utility toll is not a standard debt. It is a primary lien. It carries the authority of the state, and I had wired that authority directly into the Federal Reserve's automated clearing house. The system was doing exactly what it was built to do. It was balancing a ledger. It was moving capital from a defaulting tenant to the rightful landowner. $1 million per second. Every time a watt of energy tried to jump a circuit. Every time a server tried to ping a backup. The ghost utility clause triggered an automatic offset. Silas lunged for my feet, his hands clawing at the charcoal wool of my blazer. His breath smelled of stale champagne and the raw, ugly fear of a man who realized he was no longer human. In this world, if you have no digits on a screen, you do not exist. And I was erasing his existence. You can't link a private deed to the Fed, he screamed. The lawyers. The Treasury. They'll see the anomaly. They'll shut it down. They won't see an anomaly, said. The emerald light of my contacts seemed to fill the room. They will see a fiduciary correction. The Thorne Corp has been operating on a fundamental title defect for 30 years. The system isn't breaking, Silas. It is finally fixing itself. You are not the victim of an attack. You are the victim of a long overdue audit. I checked the tungsten watch. 600 million. The neon digits were a blur of green light. I thought about my father. I remembered the day he came home. His lab equipment seized. His patents locked in a legal vault. He had sat in the dark for 10 years, watching Silas Thorne win awards for sustainable innovation. He had died with the sound of a ticking clock in his head, counting the seconds of his stolen life. Now, the clock was on my wrist, and it was counting his life back into my hands. Institutional revenge is a cold, mathematical beauty. It doesn't require a physical weapon. It only requires a deeper understanding of the plumbing. Silas Thorne had focused on the exterior, the brand, the IPO, the lights. I had focused on the conduits, the debt, the darkness. The violet nodes on the hologram were almost all black now. The Thorne family trust fund, gone. The corporate escrow for the New Jersey wind farm, gone. The private accounts for his board of directors, gone. A cross-default chain reaction had been triggered because Thorne Corp was the guarantor for dozens of other energy projects. The freeze was spreading. Every bank associated with Silas Thorne was currently receiving a sovereign asset seizure notice. Their computers were shutting down his access. Their algorithms were flagging him as a systemic risk. Silas Thorne was officially the most expensive man in the world, and he couldn't even pay for a glass of water. I pulled the silver tablet back. The hologram vanished, leaving us in the deep, bloody red glow of the emergency lights. The temperature had dropped further. I could see Silas's breath in the air, foggy, frail, the breath of a ghost. The freeze is complete, I whispered. Thorne Corp is no longer a corporate entity. It is a collection of scrap metal and illegitimate data. The accounts hit absolute zero at 9:12 p.m. I stood over him. The floor-length braids shifted, the gunmetal rings clinking with a final, lethal chime. My mahogany complexion was a dark shield, unyielding. Absolute. Silas Thorne looked up at me. The arrogance was gone. The Ivy League poise was a distant memory, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a man staring into a void he couldn't negotiate with. You planned this, he said. His voice was a ghost of a sound. Since the day he died, I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The result was on my wrist. I reached for the tungsten watch, touching the cold metal. The neon digits were steady now. 0. You told my father that the future had no room for the obsolete. I said. The emerald cat-eye contacts burned in the dark. You were right, but you forgot to check the definition. The future doesn't belong to the man with the light. It belongs to the architect of the darkness. I walked toward the emergency stairs, my charcoal coat flowing behind me like a shadow. The sound of my heels against the marble was the only thing left of the Thorne Empire. A sharp, rhythmic drumbeat of the new reign. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and the institutional freeze is absolute. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange is a cathedral built on the worship of momentum. Usually, it is a storm of noise. A frantic, caffeinated scream of human greed and digital ambition. But tonight, the air was frozen, stagnant. It smelled of ozone, burnt silicon, and the cold. A stringent scent of a panic that has moved beyond fear into the realm of absolute silence. The great digital boards, the glowing altars of global capitalism, were flashing a violent, rhythmic red. It was the visual heartbeat of a dying empire. I stood on the balcony overlooking the chaos, wrapped in a stillness that felt like a physical weight. My rich mahogany complexion was a dark, polished shield against the flickering glare of the monitors. The golden undertones of my skin glowed in the crimson light, making me look like an ancient deity presiding over a clinical execution. I reached up, slowly, my fingers grazing the gunmetal rings that bound my floor-length micro-braided ponytail. The metal felt cold, honest, industrial. They clinked with a soft, heavy sound, a series of sharp reports that echoed the closing of a tomb. Beneath my sharp brows, my emerald green cat-eye contacts didn't just watch the numbers. They dismantled them. I wasn't seeing currency. I was seeing the structural failure of a man's vanity. I was seeing the final, inevitable result of the toll protocol. I reached down, adjusting the Matte-Black Tungsten Cuff Watch on my right wrist. The watch was heavy, a cold mathematical anchor. It had no numbers for the hours. It had no hands for the minutes. Instead, it displayed a single, frantic row of neon green digits that were currently moving with a lethal velocity. Thorne Corp stock $40-2 30 seconds ago. It was 200. The market was finally processing the ghost utility clause. The high-frequency trading algorithms had sensed the systemic hemorrhage. They realized that Thorne Corp wasn't just losing money. It was being hollowed out from the inside by a sovereign utility deed. $1 million per second. Every time a watt of energy moved, the company's liquidity was being vaporized. I checked the watch again. 20-8. Silas Thorne was somewhere in the darkness of his tower, likely clutching a dead phone, searching for a loophole in a world where I had already rewritten the code. He thought he was a titan. He thought his $500 billion valuation was a wall that could stop any audit. He didn't realize that in my world, valuation is just a collective hallucination. Debt, however, is the only thing that is truly real. Institutional revenge is a cold, calculated symphony. I remembered the day Silas evicted my father. The smell of the old lab being cleared out. The sound of the heavy boots on the floor. The way Silas had looked at his gold watch and told my father that his time was up. He had stolen the patents. He had weaponized the non-compete clause. He had erased 30 years of my father's life in 30 minutes. Now, I was returning the favor. With interest, the digital ticker on my wrist was a blur of neon. Green. $15.12. The New York Stock Exchange triggered the first circuit breaker. The trading stopped for 15 minutes. A desperate attempt to catch the falling knife. But the algorithms were smarter than the regulators. They knew that a circuit breaker cannot stop a sovereign lien. The debt was not coming from the market. The debt was coming from the conduits, from the earth. From me. I stood in the shadow of the balcony, watching the frantic traders below. They were small, insignificant. They were moths trying to trade the light of a star that had already gone supernova. The scent of the room changed. The metallic temps of ozone intensified, as if the very air was ionizing under the pressure of the financial collapse. The internal monologue of a structural debt architect is a place of absolute zero. I felt the pulse in my fingertips, steady, slow, 48 beats per minute. the heart rate of a panther watching the final, dying twitches of its prey. The circuit breaker ended. The trading resumed. The digits on my tungsten cuff didn't just fall. They disintegrated. $9, 4, 2. Silas Thorne was no longer a billionaire. He was a man standing on a pile of scrap metal. By linking the toll protocol to his personal guarantees, I had ensured that the collapse would not stop at the corporate level. The cross-default acceleration was now in effect. His private bank accounts, his real estate, his very legacy. Everything was being pulled into the gravity of the zero. I looked at the Matte-Black Tungsten Watch, 0.50.50 cents, for a company that once claimed to own the future, for a name that was supposed to be eternal. It was now worth less than a gallon of gas, less than the copper in the wires Silas Thorne had tried to steal. The final plummeted began. The market had reached the stage of total liquidation. There were no buyers, only ghosts. The neon digits flickered one last time, 0.01.1 cent. I stood in the darkness. The emerald Katai contacts in my eyes seemed to glow with a deep internal fire, reflecting the final, dying spark of the Thorne Empire. The room was cold, perfectly silent. The great digital boards of the exchange had gone dark. Unable to track a number that had essentially reached the bottom of the universe, Silas Thorne was officially a pauper. He didn't just lose his money. He lost his access. He lost his authority. He lost the right to the very light he had stolen. I reached up and touched the gunmetal rings in my hair. The weight of the braids felt like a victory lap. The sound of the metal was a period at the end of a 30-year sentence. The audit was complete. The accounts were closed. The structural failure was total. I turned and walked away from the balcony, my charcoal coat flowing behind me like a shadow. The sound of my heels against the stone floor was the only thing left of the Thorne era. Sharp, rhythmic drumbeat of the new reign. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and I just deleted a dynasty. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft hissing sound. In the mirrored wall, I saw the reflection of the woman Silas Thorne thought was a ghost. The emerald eyes were steady, unyielding. The stock collapse was not the end. It was the clearance. The land was now empty. The air was now clean. And the grid was finally ready for a new architect. I checked the Matte-Black Tungsten Watch one last time. 0.01. Stay there, Silas, I whispered. It's the only number you ever truly earned. The air in the federal liquidation court was cold. It tasted of old paper, sterile floor wax, and the slow, rotting scent of institutional failure. Outside, the Manhattan sky was a bruised shade of violet. Rain streaked the high windows, each drop sounding like a gavel hitting a block. Inside, the silence was a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the lungs work harder for every breath. Silas Thorne sat at the defense table. He was a man hollowed out by his own shadows. His navy suit was wrinkled. His silk tie was pulled loose. The image of the Green Titan had been replaced by the reality of a common thief. I walked through the double doors. My movement was silent, mathematical, the grace of a panther moving through the ruins of a city. My rich mahogany skin glowed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, the golden undertones of my complexion shimmering like polished wood in an ancient gallery. I felt the weight of my micro-braided high ponytail. The floor-length braids were a heavy, braided shadow behind me. Each strand was wrapped in polished gunmetal rings. They clinked with a soft, industrial rhythm, the sound of a machine that was finally finishing its cycle. I reached the plaintiff's table and stood perfectly still. I didn't look at Silas. I didn't need to. I could feel his desperation radiating off him like heat from a cooling engine. My emerald green cat-eye contacts were fixed on the judge. They were two glowing embers in the dim room, auditing the legal landscape with cold precision. I reached down, my fingers grazing the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The metal was an anchor, a cold promise of zero. The neon green digits flickered, tracking the final interest calculations. The judge looked down at the documents. His face was a mask of weary professionalism. "Thorne Corp is filing for Chapter 11 protection," he said, his voice echoing in the vaulted room. "They are seeking a stay on all asset seizures. They claim the transfer fees are predatory. They are asking for a restructuring period." Silas Thorne's lead counsel stood up. He was a man who cost $5,000 an hour. But today, he looked like a man who was working for free. "Your Honor, the Jaxon Trust is trying to bankrupt the East Coast grid. $1 million a second is not a fee. It is a death sentence. No court in this country can allow a private entity to seize a multi-billion-dollar corporation." Based on a 1952 utility easement, I stepped forward. The gunmetal rings in my hair sang a sharp, lethal warning. The internal monologue of a structural debt architect is a place of absolute zero. I wasn't listening to his arguments. I was listening to the sound of the foundation cracking. I wasn't seeing a lawsuit. I was seeing a reversion event. It is not a death sentence. I said my voice was a low, sovereign frequency. It is a compulsory satisfaction. The 1952 easement is not a standard contract. It is a sovereign infrastructure deed, and Silas Thorne has default on his obligations to the earth. I tapped a command into the silver tablet on the table. A holographic display erupted in the center of the courtroom. It was the 1952 subsurface map. The red lines of the conduits were pulsing with a deep, violet light. Total debt, $9 billion. $600 million. Silas Thorne stood up. His chair screeched against the floor. A jagged, ugly sound. $9 billion. He screamed. "You've only been running the protocol for 3 hours. The math is absolute, Silas," I whispered. My emerald eyes locked onto his pupils. "The transfer fee is $1 million per second per substation. You tried to reroute the power through 9 different hubs. The automated billing system simply followed the energy. The debt is not an estimate. It is a reality recorded by the Federal Reserve." I turned back to the judge. "Under the reverse eminent domain clause of the 1952 Act, if a utility tenant defaults on a sovereign infrastructure debt that exceeds their net book value, ownership of the connected assets reverts to the deed holder. This is not a bankruptcy. This is a satisfaction of debt." The courtroom went perfectly silent. The kind of silence that precedes a total system failure. The lawyers looked at their tablets, searching for the clause. They found it. Section 44, the Infrastructure Reversion Protocol. It was a law built for a different world. A world of massive, post-war projects. It was a law meant to protect the city from failing monopolies. It was a law my father had memorized while he sat in his dark workshop, watching Silas Thorne build a throne on stolen ground. He knew the city would never change the code. They were too lazy, too arrogant. They left the reverse eminent domain in the archives, a legal landmine waiting for 30 years. Silas Thorne collapsed back into his chair. The sandalwood scent of his success was gone, replaced by the cold, damp smell of the grave. He looked at the matte-black tungsten watch on my wrist. The neon digits were still moving. 9 billion. 700 million. The judge looked at the hologram. Then at Silas. "The law is clear," he said. The words were final. A gavel hitting the heart of an empire. "Thorne Corp has defaulted on a sovereign infrastructure debt. The assets are no longer subject to Chapter 11. They are encumbered by a primary lien, a lien held by the Jaxon Infrastructure Trust." I adjust the gunmetal rings in my hair. The weight of the braids felt like the weight of the grid. Heavy, unrelenting, absolute. I thought about my father's medical bills. I thought about the house Silas Thorne had seized. I thought about the 30 years of silence my family had endured. "The debt is being satisfied," I whispered. With interest. The reverse eminent domain was a masterclass in systemic takeover. Buy seized the physical assets to pay the toll. I hadn't just taken the company. I had taken the physical reality of Silas Thorne's world. The Thorne Tower, the patents, the server farms, the very light in the courtroom. It was all moving into my name. Silas Thorne looked at his hands. His fingers were white, bloodless. He realized that he didn't even own the air in his lungs. The Jaxon Trust owned the filters. The Jaxon Trust owned the vents. The Jaxon Trust owned the world. I reached down and touched the matte-black tungsten watch. The metal was cold, mathematical. The digits hit the final calculation. Total debt satisfied. I picked up my silver tablet. The charcoal silk of my suit rustled. A quiet, lethal sound. I turned to walk toward the exit, not looking back at the man who had tried to erase me. "The court is adjourned," I said. My voice was a low, sovereign bell. "The grid is under new management." I walked out into the corridor, my floor-length ponytail sweeping the stone floor with the sound of a closing ledger. The gunmetal rings clinked with a final, industrial goodbye. The emerald cat-eye contacts didn't reflect the light of the courthouse. They held the darkness of the foundations. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and I don't believe in restructuring. I believe in reversion. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The Manhattan rain washed the dust of the courtroom from my skin. I looked up at the Thorne Tower. The lights were still out, a jagged, black monolith in a city of light. I touched the tungsten watch. The neon digits were steady at 0. The debt was paid. The assets were seized. The empire was liquidated. Institutional revenge is not a loud event. It is a quiet, systemic deletion. It is the removal of the supports before the building even knows it is falling. And Silas Thorne was still falling. I hailed a black car. The driver opened the door in a silent, practiced motion. The interior of the vehicle smelled of new leather and silence. The perfect atmosphere for a new reign. I sat in the back and closed my eyes, listening to the steady, mathematical rhythm of the rain against the glass. The accounts were closed. The math was balanced. And the grid was finally ready for its architect. Silas Thorne is currently standing in a dark courtroom, realizing that the shoes he is wearing are technically a gift from the woman he tried to destroy. He is a tenant of the world, and his lease has just been terminated. The reverse eminent domain is absolute. The Jaxon reign has begun. The 81st floor was a tomb, made of reinforced glass and stolen ambition. The air was cold, heavy. It tasted of stagnant, filtered oxygen and the dry, acrid scent of a man who realized his throne was made of ash. Outside, the city of New York was a sea of ink. The Thorne Tower stood as the only dark monolith in a canyon of light, a structural ghost, in a world that no longer recognized its name. I stood in the center of Silas Thorne's private sanctum. My rich mahogany complexion was a dark, polished shield against the shadows. The golden undertones of my skin seemed to glow with a deep, internal fire, fueled by the closure of a 30-year audit. I reached up, my fingers grazing the gunmetal rings that bound my floor-length microbraided ponytail. The metal felt cold, honest, industrial. They clinked with a soft, heavy sound. A series of sharp reports that echoed like gavel strikes in the silence. Beneath the sharp arc of my brow, my emerald green cat-eye contacts were the only sources of light left in the room. They didn't just watch Silas, they dismantled him. I was no longer just Zoraida Jaxon. I was the architect of his erasure. Silas was hunched over his mahogany desk, clutching a gold fountain pen that had run dry of ink. His navy suit was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot, tracing the erratic patterns of a man who had spent the night in a world that no longer obeyed him. The sandalwood scent of his success had vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly smell of a man who realized he was no longer human in the eyes of the bank. "You can't do this," he rasped. His voice was a jagged shard of glass. "The building has emergency protocols. There are safety regulations. You can't lock a man in his own office in the dark." I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence grow, expanding it until it filled the 80 floors beneath our feet. I reached down, adjusting the matte-black tungsten cuff watch on my right wrist. The watch was heavy, a cold, mathematical anchor. The neon green digits flickered with a final lethal velocity. Thorne Corp stock, 0.00. The valuation was gone. The equity was gone. And now? The occupancy was gone. This is not an office, Silas, I said. My voice was a low, sovereign frequency. It didn't echo. It simply occupied the space. As of 9 p.m., this space became a sovereign infrastructure asset under the 1952 Subsurface Easement. Your right to inhabit this vertical coordinate was tied to your utility lease. The lease is terminated. The energy is cut. You are no longer a CEO. You are an obstruction. I tapped a command into the silver tablet in my hand. A holographic display erupted in the dark. It showed the tower's internal power grid. The blue lines representing the elevators and lighting were turning gray. One by one, the systems were being decommissioned by the grid itself. Silas lunged for the door, his hands fumbling for the electronic lock. The red light of the keypad didn't even flicker. It was dead, just like his corporate legacy. Open the door, Zoraida. I have heart medication in my car. I have a legal team waiting for my call. Your car is currently being towed as part of the asset seizure. I said, the emerald fire in my eyes was unyielding. And your legal team has already received their conflict of interest notices. They don't work for you anymore. They work for the Jaxon Infrastructure Trust. I stepped closer. The gunmetal rings in my hair sang a sharp, industrial goodbye. You built a sustainable future on stolen patents and buried secrets, I whispered. But sustainability requires more than a brand. It requires a foundation. You thought you could buy the sky, but you forgot to pay for the stairs. I swiped the tablet. The final circuit breaker in the building tripped. The emergency lights in the hallway vanished. The soft, electronic hum of the building's nervous system went silent. We were 80 stories up, in a hollow, stone monolith. In total, unfiltered darkness. The only thing visible was the neon green glow of my tungsten watch and the emerald embers of my contacts. There is one exit, Silas, I continued. The words were cold, clinical. The service stairwell. It is manually operated. It doesn't require electricity, just a physical, linear movement through 80 floors of concrete. Silas Thorne sank to his knees. The Ivy League poise had completely dissolved. 80 floors. In the dark. I'm 65 years old. I'll die in that stairwell. I thought about my father. I remembered the day Silas Thorne had him escorted out of the lab. He had to carry his life's work in 3 cardboard boxes. The elevators were under maintenance that day. Silas had laughed as he watched my father, a man with a failing heart, descend the stairs of his own building. He called it a legacy exit. Now, the legacy was returning to the source. Institutional revenge is not a loud event. It is a masterclass in systemic destruction. I watched Silas Thorne struggle to stand, his hands clawing at the mahogany desk, the same desk where he signed the documents that erased my family's name. He looked like a man who had realized he was already a ghost. The stairs are waiting, Silas, I said. My voice was a period at the end of a 30-year sentence. Every step is a reminder of a patent you stole. Every flight is a year you took from my father. There are 1,600 steps between you and the sidewalk. I suggest you start walking before the oxygen scrubbers shut down. I walked toward the hidden manual latch behind the desk. The door clicked open. A narrow, concrete throat opened into the darkness. The air coming from the stairwell was cold, damp. It smelled of the subsurface conduits. Silas Thorne had tried to ignore. I stepped aside, my rich mahogany skin blending into the shadows, leaving only the emerald glow of my gaze to guide him toward his fate. Silas Thorne stood at the precipice. He looked down into the black, featureless void of the stairwell. He realized that the lights were never coming back on. Not for him. He reached out, his fingers touching the cold, unfinished concrete wall. Zoraida, he whispered, please. I touched the matte black tungsten watch. The metal felt like a promise kept. The digits hit 0.00. The Thorne era was officially over. The final eviction was in progress. "Enjoy the descent, Silas," I said. The gunmetal rings clinked with a final, lethal chime. "You spent 30 years reaching for the sky. It's time you learned how much it hurts to return to the dirt." He stepped into the darkness. The first footfall on the concrete was a heavy, echoing sound. The sound of a king becoming a beggar. I watched him vanish. The door clicked shut behind him. Locking from the outside, I stood alone in the dark office. The emerald Katai contacts didn't reflect the void. They held the power of the grid. I felt the pulse in my fingertips. Steady, a calm. Mathematical 48 beats per minute. The audit was closed. The accounts were balanced. The structural failure was total. I walked toward the private elevator, the one I had reserved for the trustee. The doors opened with a soft, hissing sound. The backup power was only working for the woman who held the deed. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and I don't believe in elevators for thieves. As I descended through the 80 floors, I thought about Silas Thorne, groping his way through the dark, counting the steps, realizing that the shoes he was wearing were technically a gift from the trust. He was a tenant of the world, and his lease had been terminated. I reached the lobby and walked out into the cool night air. The city was a sea of light. $1 billion of electricity pulsing through the veins I now controlled. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the vibration of the subsurface conduits beneath my feet. The Jaxon grid was alive. I hailed a black car. The driver opened the door in a silent, practiced motion. The interior smelled of new leather and victory. I sat in the back and closed my eyes, listening to the steady, mathematical rhythm of the city. The accounts were closed. The math was balanced, and the grid was finally ready for its architect. Silas Thorne is currently somewhere on the 40th floor, realizing that the darkness is much larger than he thought. He is a man without a country, a name without a meaning, a ghost in a city that only respects the living. The final eviction is absolute. The Jaxon reign has begun. The dawn over Manhattan did not break. It arrived with the cold, clinical precision of a balanced ledger. The sky was a bruised shade of violet and slate, washing the grime of 1,000 lies from the glass towers of the elite. I stood on the private observation deck of the building formerly known as Thorne Tower. The 81st floor was silent. The frantic, caffeinated energy of the IPO had been replaced by the heavy, sanitized stillness of a new reign. I reached up, my fingers grazing the gunmetal rings that bound my floor-length microbraided ponytail. The metal felt cold against my mahogany skin, a rich, dark map of golden undertones that seemed to glow in the first light of the morning. The braids clinked with a soft, industrial rhythm as I moved, the sound of a machine that had finally achieved its purpose. Beneath the sharp arc of my brows, my emerald green cat-eye contacts were steady, unyielding. They didn't reflect the city. They owned it. I was no longer just Zoraida Jaxon. I was the architect of the grid. I reached down, adjusting the Matte-Black Tungsten Cuff Watch on my right wrist. The heavy, tungsten metal was a cold anchor against my skin. The neon green digits flickered one last time before going dark. Thorne Corp stock, delisted. The value had reached absolute zero. The empire was officially a ghost. I checked the internal security feed on my silver tablet. The service stairwell camera on the ground floor flickered to life. A heavy steel door swung open slowly. Silas Thorne stumbled out onto the sidewalk. He was a man who had been hollowed out by 80 floors of darkness. His navy suit was ruined. His hands were scraped raw from clawing at the concrete walls. He looked up at the tower. Squinting against the morning light, he was looking for his name on the building. It was gone. Workers in gunmetal gray. Uniforms were already removing the Thorne letters from the lobby marble, replacing them with a single, bold word in matte black steel. Jaxon? The Jaxon grid was no longer a theory. It was the reality of the city. I tapped a final command into the holographic interface. The institutional rewiring was complete. This was not just a name change. This was a systemic restoration. Using the billions in unpaid transfer fees I had accrued through the toll protocol, I had triggered a global banking settlement. Under the ERISA Act and the protocols of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, I had established an equitable restitution fund, the money Silas Thorne had stolen to fund his sustainable future was now flowing back to its rightful owners. I watched the data stream. 30,000 former workers. The men and women Silas had blacklisted and abandoned. Their pensions were being restored with 30 years of interest. Their health insurance was being fully funded by a sovereign endowment. The debt Silas Thorne thought he had erased was now the foundation of their security. Institutional revenge is a beautiful thing. It doesn't require a physical fight. It only requires a deeper understanding of the plumbing. Silas Thorne had focused on the brand. I had focused on the bloodline. I watched Silas on the street. He tried to hail a taxi. The driver looked at him, saw a man in a ruined suit with no phone and no credit, and drove away. Silas looked at his own shoes, realizing that even the leather on his feet was technically a leased asset of the Jaxon Trust. He was a man standing on a sidewalk he didn't own, breathing air filtered by a grid he no longer controlled. He began to walk, disappearing into the crowd of mourning commuters who no longer knew his name. He was a ghost in a city that only respects the living. The internal monologue of its structural debt architect is a place of absolute zero. I felt my pulse steady, a calm, mathematical 48 beats per minute. The heart rate of a panther watching the sun rise over a new world. I thought about my father. I remembered the scent of his old workshop, the smell of grease and burnt copper. I remembered the way his hands shook as he tried to explain the 1952 easements to a board of directors that didn't care. They called him a madman. They called him obsolete. Now, the Jaxon grid was powering the very boardrooms that had mocked him. The subsurface conduits were his legacy. The light of the city was his signature. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and I don't believe in mercy. I believe in fiduciary duty. I believe in sovereign deeds, and I believe that when you steal a man's future, the earth eventually finds a way to take back the rent. The audit is closed. The accounts are balanced. The structural failure of the Thorne era is total. I stepped away from the balcony and walked toward the CEO office. My charcoal coat flowed behind me like a shadow. The floor-length braids clinked with a final, lethal chime. The gunmetal rings sang a song of victory. I sat in the chair that used to belong to a thief. I reached down, touching the matte-black tungsten watch. The neon digits flickered back to life. They were no longer tracking a stock price. They were tracking the energy output of a new era. Jaxon grid, 100% capacity. The city was resurrected. The math was absolute. And the Matriarch's will was finally law. I am Zoraida Jaxon, and the grid belongs to me. The end.